Okay, so we're going to get started. So we're talking about integration, and I'll start with the certificates and talking about TwoWay SSL, and then Edith's going to take over with security and OAuth, and then hopefully Suzanne and Nadina will join in and talk about their topics. And then we just finished intros, but we have Crystal that joined us to listen in, and then we've got myself, Nikki, and Edith so far. So I'm going to start off talking about certificates. So I just wanted to first start off with some definitions. That SSL stands for Secure Socket Layers, and TLS, Transport Layer Security. So a bunch of acronyms. But they're both talking about how to encrypt and data and authenticate between applications. So not necessarily encrypting your data in Salesforce database, but as you pass data back and forth, if you're sending it over the internet, that's insecure versus internally in your own company's intranet. And it does talk, it's just really talking about that handshake or that connection between the client and the server. It doesn't do any encryption, but it basically tells each of the other that they know who each other is. It's kind of, and so that now you can send data back and forth, trusting that the person receiving it is who you think it should be. And from my reading, it seems that the TLS has actually come out of SSL. So SSL was an earlier rendition of this, and TLS has been developed from there. But the wording is often interchangeable. And the idea, as I said, is to secure between two endpoints and to avoid a middleman attack or somebody tapping in and listening in passively, like pulling your information as it goes back and forth and getting a feed from there. So that's kind of the purpose of this protocol. And so there's one-way SSL and then there's two-way SSL. So the first scenario is, let's say Salesforce is calling out to another application or vice versa. Someone's calling out to another server, and that server has a certificate that they send back to the first application. And that application says, okay, I know who you are, so we're good. Where the other way, two ways, they go back and forth. So down here, you can see application first says, send something out to connection to server B or application B. It sends its certificate back, and then it says, hey, show me your certificate. And so the client will authenticate or verify that their certificate it got, and then send its own across to the other side as well. So that's the two-way SSL, where each of the services trusts the other. And so that's a higher level of authentication or of security if you do that two-way or mutual authentication. And so Salesforce is saying, okay, application, I trust you. And that application is saying, okay, good, because now I know that you're Salesforce. And so now we can send each other data back and forth. And then I have a link down here that's also in the resources to read a little bit more specifically about the mutual authentication. So certificates are included. We just talked about this two-way passing these certificates back and forth. So there's two kinds of certificates that Salesforce talks about. One is a CA signed versus self-signed. So CA stands for Certificate Authority. So there's a bunch of companies out there that are recognized as a company or authority that can give out and verify certificates. So you have to pay for that. And Salesforce has a list that you can find in their help system of all the different CAs that they will recognize. And so that's required for external systems coming into Salesforce to authenticate. From my reading, it seems Salesforce doesn't accept self-signed certificates if you're coming in trying to say who you are, that it wants a CA signed. And then the self-signed is a certificate that you can just create in Salesforce. So there's a screenshot I put in here of the certificate and key management page in your setup. And you can just literally click on create self-signed certificate, give it a name, fill out a few details, and then you're done, you've got it. And it will expire in a certain, I think it was a year, when I set one up, it was a year in dev and 2 years in production. So this is the page where you can see what certificates you have and then you can create your self-signed. If you're going to do the CA sign, there's a few more steps because you always have to you have to buy it from the certificate authority, and they give you a file that you upload. So there's a little more steps there. And you can use the self-signed in various scenarios. So my next slide talks a little bit about where these are from and who creates self-signed. But just to continue on with this page, so we have a list of our certificates and when they are expiring or if they have expired. And then there's a section here also with encryption keys. So this has to do with the classic version of encrypted data types. So not Salesforce Shield, but just when you go to create a new field, you have a choice for creating an encrypted data, like a social insurance number, social security number, credit card number, that kind of data. And so when you create those, you have an option to start, it creates, as soon as you start creating them, data, it'll assign an encryption key to that data. And then if you want to later archive and create a new key, you can do that here just by clicking on archive current key and create new one, and it automatically creates a new one. But they do have some warnings because the encryption, before you delete it, it will, you have to sort of basically update all of your encrypted data that you have to have it pick up the new key. And you'd want to do that before you delete your key, because otherwise you can't unencrypt or decrypt any of these encrypted data type fields if you actually put like values in it. But that's what it's talking about in the middle section. And then in the bottom section, it talks about the API client certificate. So you pick which certificate you want to use for any of the API usage. So outbound messages, delegated authentication, and SAML assertions will use that. If you're doing an Apex callout, you can actually pick what certificate you want in the class when you're doing the callout. And then you also want to actually have this take effect, you want to have the profile of the integration user, have the setting to enforce SSL or TLS mutual authentication permission, and then it starts to use this and pass that certificate out. So that's this page. Now, a lot of people I've seen online get emails that say, hey, you've got a self-signed certificate that's about to expire. And you get emails, let me see what I read about this. You get notifications for that 60 days before, 30 days before, and 10 days before, if you are a sysadmin or you happen to have modifile data and view set up. And there's been tons of people like, where did this key come from, certificate come from? I don't even know what it is. Why am I getting this email? Can I just delete it? What's going on with that? So there's a link here to one of the help. There's quite a few responses, but there's a help article that talks about what to do. And then also I'm going to talk about a couple of situations that actually creates a self-signed certificate that you may not be aware of. And this seems to be a lot of the case of why people are saying, what's happening with this? So when you enable My Domain, once you've picked your domain and you've tested it and you deploy it, it actually generates a self-signed certificate automatically in case you need it to become an identity provider. So My Domain just means you pick, you want to have your company name.my.salesforce.com instead of having your instance NA55 or whatever it is. But when you have My Domain enabled, you can also then use Salesforce as an identity provider, meaning you could have it be, you could have another app in your company that it checks your user and your permissions based on whether you are a valid user in Salesforce. So you kind of go into Salesforce and go from there. So anyhow, when you enable My Domain, it creates a certificate, and it seems to be called self-signed, such and such with the date that it's created. And if you're not using Salesforce as an identity provider, then I haven't seen any reason why you should renew it. It's used in this scenario, it's used as an identity provider. And what you can do is go into your system and look, search the setup for identity provider. And this is the page you'd see if you're using it as an identity provider. If you don't have anything in here, then you don't have it set up, and as far as I can see, you can get rid of that self-signed certificate or not worry about the fact that it's disabled or it's expired. So that's one of the reasons why you might see one in your org, is when you set up My Domain. Another one is for single sign-on. So if you do have single sign-on set up, then there may be a certificate there where you can, in your single sign-on settings, you'll see reference to the request signing certificate, and there's a drop-down that shows you all your valid certificates. So that's another place where you might look if you're getting these expiry notices. You can see in there if you've got something that's pending. And then the other one that I thought was cool, I just delved into a little bit, is Environment Hub. So this is actually, most customers don't have this set up, but it would be used if you have like a multi-org situation in your company, or, pardon me, you're an ISV partner, so you create a App Exchange packages, or if you're a consulting company and you want to, you can sign up your clients under as a member of your hub. So I've got that myself, so to show you if you wanted to see. So basically, when you have to ask to get Environment Hub enabled by support, and then you basically get a master org, which in my case is my production org, and I needed to have my domain enabled in order to use this, so that creates a self-signed certificate in my system. And then I become the identity provider, so I can log in with single sign-on into my member orgs. And when I set up a member org, it actually creates a self-signed certificate in their org automatically. And it's tagged with my org's name, but it creates one in their org. And then in my side, I get a service provider listing. So you can see here, I've got my identity provider set up is here with a valid certificate. And then I have 2 different service providers listed under here. And normally you'd be creating these like Facebook and wherever you're going to be logging into as a connected app. But with Environment Hub, it's a little bit different. You create it under the Environment Hub area. So I was going to show you a quick demo if you wanted to see. So this is this is my production system, and this is what happens when you sign up for, or you get the Environment Hub enabled. Basically, get another app with a tab, and then you can create. It creates for me I'm the master here, and then I have a bunch of sandboxes that I can generate, or you can connect to an org. So I have an example here with one of my clients, where I've got it set up to SSO into their system. So if I click login from here, it attaches my personal user to what Salesforce user I have in their system. And so now if I look at the certificates on their side, you can see here's the certificate that was generated when I set that up. So this one is, so these guys might get an email at some point in 2020 and say, what's the certificate doing? And that's why it's created. So if they got rid of it, it would impact my single sign-on to be able to come into their system as a member. And then if we looked back over here under my identity provider on my side, on the master side, that's where I have these 2 different orgs. Those are the org IDs of my members. And it's using this particular signed one that I had to make sure is active. So that's another reason. It may not be a common one, but that could be another reason that a certificate, a self-signed certificate, gets created in your system and you have no idea who created it and what it's used for. Okay, so that was my deep dive into certificates and the TwoWay. There's lots more to know, obviously, but there's some links in the resources section for that as well. So, Edith, do you want to take it away?
Yes. I started researching into security, but there are lots of resources about it. It's like a whole world. So I focus on kind of the first part, OAuth. As I think Niki mentioned last session that Charlie has like 2 very good talks about OAuth. So I think I'm just focusing like in the view of the data integration, how can we use that, or what is important for us in this exam, I would say, or my wild guess, because I think there is this other exam that focuses a lot on that. So this is just gonna be like a kind of introduction to this. So the security, we can start with the inbound connections. That means that an external system wants to connect to Salesforce. In this case, any client application that you want to connect to Salesforce, all of them are treated as users. So it means that you have to create a user for your integration, and is suggested that you create one and you put permissions specifically for the things that that user has to access. So it has to be like a special user just for your integrations. And all the standard Salesforce security mechanisms apply for this user. It's the way that we use authentication. We can also restrict the network and the session security, all the data security with a sharing model, and all of this is applies for the user. And you can also use the TLS or HTTPS that Niki mentioned about in the previous slides. So about user authentication, well, Salesforce uses the username and password. We can authenticate into Salesforce using the login page, the normal web page, using all the flows of OAuth, rather the flow that is using username and password, and using APIs. There is another way of authenticate, that is the single sign-on that Niki also mentioned. This is when, for example, you have another provider, for example, Gmail, you just log into Gmail and then you connect it to Salesforce, and there is no need to provide any more username or passwords in Salesforce because you are already signed on another provider. You can also add additional criteria for your authentication. For example, you can also ask that the user provides a security token or a two-factor authentication. This can be seen sometimes when you are a user in Salesforce and you are sent a 4-digit security code that you have to type in sometimes to add authentication into this process. And in this case, to restrict the access to resources, we use the profiles or permission sets. But there are some permissions that are special for our integrations, and is the API enable and API only user and password never expires. Because sometimes we have integrations that actually, it has happened to me that sometimes I have external systems that are sending information to Salesforce every night, for example, and sometimes there is something wrong happening and we don't really know what, and sometimes it's just because the password expired. Now, regarding OAuth, as I said, this is going to be just like a kind of like introduction to this, but if you want to know more, you can go to the slides that Charlie had in our group. Well, this is an open protocol and is used basically for authorization. In this case, a user authorizes one site to access another site on behalf of himself. In this case, for integrations, we can use OAuth for a user to authorize someone external to use the resources in Salesforce. The advantages of using this OAuth are that it's HTTP based, so it's kind of simple. Well, simple in the way that the infrastructure is already there set up, we are just using it. Also, the interfaces in Salesforce are already there, we just configure it. And this is, we can use it and works great for mobile applications, and reduces the security and management issues because we don't have to kind of replicate the passwords or users in another system. We just kind of centralize everything, in this case in Salesforce. And all the user just authorize another application to access the data in Salesforce. Here, in here we can see a kind of a general description of the flows. In this case, we have the user in the bottom. The user wants to access some, for example, some services of data from in another server. And sometimes what we can find is that we have a specialized server that is going to be the one that is used for authorization, is where we can find the usernames and passwords. And well, we can obviously use Salesforce for it, but there are many other providers that you can use as the one that are the ones that keep the security issues. So what happens is that the user, when he wants to, when a client wants to access the resources in the server, first goes to the user for it to introduce the login and password and to authorize the client application. And then once that flow has been approved by the authorization server, the server sends the tokens to the client, and the client starts using those tokens with the server that provides the data, and without the need of the user to continue to even be there in some flows. Something kind of important in these OAuth are the tokens and the authentication flows. There are many authentication flows, and some are kind of more complicated than others. But I think mainly for integration, I think it's important to know when and why to use a given flow. And this is very kind of, it is very detailed on the information in the web, but basically it is kind of what sort of client is going to access your server, your Salesforce data. For example, if you have a web server, that means that you can store in a secure form all the tokens that are going to be used to interchange information. So in that case, you can use, for example, the web server one. Or in some cases, you are using, for example, a mobile application or an application that you have installed in your laptop, for example. In that case, you cannot ensure that the codes that are going to be exchanged are stored in a secure form. Or for example, when you are connecting from a web browser. So in that case, there is another type of flow, for example, is that the user agent that you can use when you cannot kind of store in a secure way the tokens. There are other flows, for example, the ones when you have to communicate to servers, for example, and you don't have a user that is going to be typing their username or password all of the time. In that case, we can use this other type that uses the concepts that Niki talked us about. That is using certificates between them both, so they trust each other and they can communicate even using OAuth. But maybe sometimes you have devices or Internet of Things. In these cases, you can use these other types of flows to send information between the authentication server and Salesforce. And also, I didn't get much this SAM, AML ones, but for example, sometimes you already have authenticated with another identity provider, and you want to use that authentication with Salesforce. So you can send like a JSON sign token to the authentication server, and the token uses like a private key to get the information from that token and grant permissions to you. And the simple one is the username and password. In this case, this is not recommended because the username and password are always sent back and forward between the service provider and the authentication server. So that can be used just for testing, but not really for production environments. And depending on the type of flow that you are going to use, there are different tokens that you can be interchanging between the authorization server and the resource server. Yeah, but as I said, I think that the most important thing for integration would be to know what type of device you are connected to Salesforce or what type of client, and based on that, kind of selecting the different flows that you can be using in these OAuth flows. And in order to use the OAuth with Salesforce, you have to set up a connected app. In here, you define the consumer key and the consumer secret. Well, the connected app generates those for you. You can set up security controls. For example, what kind of information the client that is going to connect can access, the scopes, for OAuth that these are related to the type of flow that you're going to be using to connect to the server. Some policies for the user when he wants to reconnect. And for example, if you're going to use SAML service, you also can define the settings here. So basically, the connector is like the source of truth, let's say, that keeps all the settings that your client is going to use in order to connect to your server. And I have a small example of Java that it was in the
this one.
Yep. Well, this is kind of an example of Java how you can connect to Salesforce using OAuth. In here, we can see that we are going to use the password, that is the simpler one. And we have to know which is the URL of Salesforce to connect. For example, in this case, it's going to be OAuth, and we are going to get a token using the type of passwords. So we are expected to send the username and password, as we can see here in the bottom. And something very important is the client ID and the client secret. Those two values, you can get them from the connected app that you set up. Then the only thing that you have to do is just to send a post request using that URL. And the server is going to return a value. If everything is okay, it's going to return the token that is in the bottom. And you just can get the token in a JSON form and use that token later to access the resources. And it also sends the instance because with Salesforce, you don't know which instance, because it's dynamic. You don't know which one is going to be assigned to you or to the application that you are accessing. Yeah, basically. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Okay, Susanna, you're up.
Yes, great. So I focused this week on state management. It's a relatively, not a huge topic, but it's a follow-up from last week where we talked about the different types of patterns, the different types of integration patterns. And one of the things that was mentioned sort of as a footnote to each of the patterns that I didn't quite fully understand was the idea of how state is managed and how it's managed a little bit differently in some of these different patterns. So I wanted to spend some time to understand it and then be able to sort of teach it back. And I definitely wanted to take advantage of the format of this group. And there are a couple of things that I would love to get other folks' sort of impression on. And maybe we can have a little bit of a discussion on that, especially in some of the later patterns. So I'll kick it off by focusing on request and reply and how state is managed in this pattern. This one's pretty straightforward. Essentially, you know, when we're using any of these integration patterns, being able to track state and essentially being able to track, you know, attributes of the particular records that we're integrating either from Salesforce or to a remote system. Having a way to make sure that we're like matching those two records, and so that each system, whether it be Salesforce or the remote system, knows how to uniquely identify that particular record and then pass the information back and forth. So that's sort of the idea of state management. And for request and reply in particular, you can essentially have one of two options in tracking and managing state. And the two options really depend on which system is considered to be the master system for that data. So essentially, if Salesforce is the master system and say, you know, we track everything about an account in Salesforce, and Salesforce is, you know, where we track account details, but maybe there's a remote order system that only handles like some transactional data about that account. And we want to be able to, from Salesforce, request information about a particular order and have maybe like an order number come back to us into our master system. The way that we would handle that, like passing back and forth and making sure that we're matching up the correct data, would be for either the remote system to store the Salesforce record ID. That would be the key, the primary key that would help us keep state between the two systems. Or we could use what's called a surrogate key. Essentially, I thought of this, again, we can talk about it, but I thought of this as like an external, maybe a custom external ID that you create. If you would want to use that instead of like the primary literal Salesforce ID, that would be the thing that the remote system stores, and that would allow us to pass information back and forth between Salesforce and the remote system. And then the other sort of the reverse situation, say there was a remote system that was the system of record or was the master system, and we just use Salesforce to track maybe some transactional data or whatever. If that remote system was a system of record, then we would, so the call to the remote system would actually return the unique key from that external application, and then Salesforce would store that key, and that key would be sort of the primary source of keeping the records in sync. And similarly, it can either be, a primary key like Salesforce ID if Salesforce is a master system, and then if it's a remote system, that can be any unique record field that's in that remote system that Salesforce would then in turn store, likely as an external ID custom field as well. So that's the sort of simple one, request and reply state management. And if we go to the next slide, the fire and forget one is something that I hadn't really thought about how to track state management with this, but this one was actually interesting to me, something I'd never thought of before. But essentially it's the same thing, right? We have the need to have either a primary key or some sort of secondary or surrogate key that is stored on either side of the integration that we're building. If this master system is Salesforce, then it's fairly straightforward, just like our other example. The remote system would store the Salesforce record ID or another, like an external ID that we've defined, and that would be how the two systems, manage state across that particular record. But if the remote system is the master, it actually gets quite interesting in the fire and forget pattern because it's asynchronous. So we're not, just sending out a call and then waiting for the system to return a piece of information for a particular record. Because it's asynchronous, we can't actually just wait for that initial transaction to send us the unique identifier. So in the initial call, right, to the remote process, Salesforce actually provides a unique ID, and that remote system then uses that unique ID to pass back the remote system's unique identifier. So it's essentially like a temporary, like Salesforce sends a temporary unique identifier that the remote system can then use to the call when they call back to Salesforce. But the ID that's actually gets stored and that actually will be, used to manage state is that remote system's unique ID. That's something that I'd never thought about, the need for that like intermediary key before, but I think that's something that is relatively important to know about. And then the next two, I think, were the remote call-in was, again, very similar to, it was very similar to our first example. Essentially, if, again, it's in Salesforce, the remote system would store either the primary or the surrogate key. And then it gets slightly more interesting, if it's the remote system is the master system. So in this scenario, right, Salesforce is storing a reference to its unique identifier in the remote system. And because, as opposed to the fire and forget, this process is actually synchronous, the key can be provided as part of the same transaction. And it would essentially just use external ID fields for that, for storing that particular ID. And then I think the last one is where I definitely wanted to sort of ask some folks their opinions on this. So the last pattern where state management was or referenced in the documentation was for batch data synchronization. And there were, in the documentation, they mentioned two things. So one was that in batch data synchronization, you manage state by using surrogate keys between the two systems. So that's a little bit different. So they're suggesting, neither system is holding is using like a primary key, like a Salesforce ID. We're using surrogate keys in both cases. And then the other factor that I thought was interesting is that they're saying if you need to maintain any type of transaction management across the Salesforce entities as part of that that integration, then instead of using batch data synchronization, then you should use the remote call-in pattern. And I had, I was trying to figure out sort of like a real life example for that. Like, when would you need to manage really manage that transaction type? And I had thought in my reading that it was if you had to, like, say if part of the batch fails, do you want to roll back the entire operation or do a partial insert? I think that's what they meant, but definitely correct me if I read that part differently than maybe other folks might have read it. And then the last, again, sort of just interesting fact that I wasn't quite aware of was some of the record locking that might happen as part of the batch data synchronization pattern. So essentially, and I'd seen this as a user a lot, but if we're using this batch data synchronization pattern, Salesforce doesn't actually maintain the state of the record, that's being edited by a specific user. So what folks might have seen in the past is if you're looking at a particular record, you have it in edit mode and you've typed a change, you're from the front end UI, you're trying to save the record. If you try to save the record, what Salesforce is doing is checking to see if another user might have updated the record in the interim. And if that record has been updated and you're not looking at the freshest version of that record, then the system will notify the user that, has the page open and you're waiting to save. And it will say, in order to finish your operation, you actually need to refresh and get the latest version of the record before proceeding with their updates. So that's something, when you see that, that's something that was referred to as standard optimistic record locking. And that's something that was, again, a new term to me, but is something that can happen with this batch data synchronization and keeping state between records in an integration. So that, I think, is my last slide. But I definitely, went a little bit down the rabbit hole on state management and integrations. But if anyone has any other comments or thoughts on that, definitely feel free to chime in or correct me.
Yeah, one of the things I was doing research on last week about batch data sync was sort of around this locking, and their recommendation was to really try to time the batch data job so that it's running off hours, so that you don't hit this as much as you might if you were running a big update on data while your sales team is working. So that was there wasn't really much of a solution to that other than the timing. Okay, so Nadina, you're up on Mashups and Canvas.
Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you now.
Oh, and then Suzanne, to your point, you just run it off hours. That's the only thing I know how to do, like writing the batches as well. You just run it off hours, like when the team's not working, and hope and pray. Okay, so this week I spent working on Mashups and Canvas. And I was actually quite refreshed. So like I told y'all, I did the integration class. So I was kind of looking over the notes there. But the docs that they provide have videos with, I don't remember who it was that was giving the presentations, but it was actually really refreshing because they kind of went over the information and gave good examples. So just kind of like a summary of the information, like they went over the definition and then 2 forms, so links and iframes. And then some of the benefits they were talking about was like low cost, reusability, why reinvent the wheel in terms of mashups. And then some caveats were like, with external mashups, you have now external API call limitations that you kind of have to focus on. And then the terms of use, so the examples there were like, if you're using like Google, they have a robust terms of use, but if you're using a new third party, their terms of use might be limited. And then from like a data security standpoint, your ITT might not necessarily want to use that mashup within your Salesforce instance, just because it's not like robust, it's not documented. And then another thing was stability. So you're trusting that the mashup you're using is going to be up. So if you have a uptime that you've specified and you deliver to your company, you're now trusting that this mashup can also meet at least the bare minimum of that uptime, which is kind of an unknown factor just because it's external. And then moving on to the next slide, so kind of summary on links. They used to take users to external Salesforce systems. You can implement them with buttons, custom links, formula fields, visual force tags. It's an asynchronous solution, so there's no load until the user actually initiates the link, so clicking the button or the link. So I thought that was pretty good on the processing time. And then moving on, iframe. These are web tags, or you can do visual force tags with specifically iframe. And then this is a synchronous solution, so the user has to wait until the content is loaded. So sometimes that can cause some frustration if the data is taking a lot, or if it's a lot of data that has to come back. And so that was pretty much for mashups. It was pretty straightforward. And then Canvas/Canvas apps. So when I was getting into this, I kind of got into connected apps, but I didn't add information here. I'll probably talk about that for maybe my next presentation. But just to define, like, it's a framework for making external web applications accessible to select users within Salesforce. That was like the key within Salesforce. And then these were the different ways that you can use Canvas, so with cheddar tabs, visual force page, etc. The application access is controlled by administrators, so that's what makes Canvas so great. So you can do sign requests or OAuth policy, and then you can also control access via permission sets and session level security. And then I actually got this from the presentation they gave. So it's talking about the same origin policy. So basically, if it's on the same domain, it's okay to have the data interacting. The problem is when it's not on the same domain. And so the way how Canvas and the same origin policy kind of works, they have to like reach out to this external application and then talk to Salesforce, and then Salesforce talks back to the external application, and then the data connection happens with that external application page. So that was really interesting. And then they talked about the sign request or OAuth. Sign request is preferred because of less chatter across the network, built-in infrastructure. And then these are some reasons why when you should use OAuth. So if it already has it set up, if the company is more comfortable with OAuth, the authentication information should not be sent automatically. But the sign request was the best practice that they like stressed that a lot during the presentation. That sign request was the best. And then if we move on, so yeah, so now they spent a lot of time talking about kind of Canvas and the security. So I thought this was pretty good, so I snipped this information here. So Canvas sits within connected apps, and they were talking about doing the post and how Canvas allows the HTTP post or a GET, but a post is more preferable. And then that was basically it for that information. And I think that was my slide. So really, there's like a great video that they have in the integration Trailhead that was like 40 minutes that kind of just went over. But what was really good too is it had documentation, and I didn't explore this much, but basically creating like a Canvas app and going through the notions of doing it. So that was really helpful. that it had like guided exercises as well.
All right, so you found that just on the Trailhead, looking up Canvas?
Yeah, so like, no, if you go to the, it might be one of these videos that I linked as well, but if you actually go to like the integration Trailhead, they have like the one is the force.com Canvas, and there's like a 45-minute presentation. And then there's another one, and I think that one was on Mashups. But it's like the integration Trailhead that we've been like linking to.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, the trail mix, sorry.
Okay.
The one that we just keep linking to. Yeah, it's in there. And so they had like a great video explaining it, and a lot of information was actually a repeat from like the integration class. I really like that, with some fresh examples.
Okay. Did you look at this one, or it was more a video somewhere?
I think if you click the links that I have, it has like the exact videos I did, because I do remember. So like that force.com Canvas is one. This was like a document that I read.
Okay.
Let's see. So yeah, those two at the end are the ones. One was on mashups and visual forces, and the force.com Canvas video was really straightforward. And it's like 45 minutes. So it kind of goes through the notions of setting up Canvas and having a real user story. And at the end, there's like training and exercises you can do.
Okay, great. Awesome. Okay. Well, that's great. We have a couple people joining in just to listen. So maybe if there's questions, we could take a couple. I've got Crystal was on at the beginning, and then it looks like Natalia joined, and then Atul Gupta also joined. So I don't know if anyone wants to say hi or has any questions about any of these topics. We have a couple extra minutes.
This is Natalia. I just had a question about encryption keys. You had talked about how, like, if you change the key, you need to re-encrypt all your data. Did you come across any use cases for when you would want to change your encryption key? It seems like kind of a dangerous thing to do.
Yeah, so you're talking
got a
about
good
this
reason
master
for it.
encryption?
Yeah.
It didn't really talk about that unless, yeah, I couldn't really think of why you would either, because you do, when you archive it, you have to basically update all the records that you had encrypted data to then start using the new one. I could look into that. I'm not sure if somehow somebody was able to get at the data. Yeah, I didn't really find a use case for that.
Okay.
All right. So that was great. I want to know if anybody has ideas for the next round. I guess I'll start with our core group here to see if anyone wants to do another session for next Monday, or anything else they want to expand on.
I've a thought. I was going to do JSON basics. So that's one of the, I think one of the links in the trail mix. And just for my own learning, I'd like to get a little more comfortable with like working with JSON. So
okay,
I thought of doing that.
Okay, great. Edith, did you have anything that you wanted to go over?
Yeah, I think it's the second part of security, because it's based on network, session, and the transport layer security.
Okay. So security part 2?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. How about yourself, Nadina? Did you want to dive into anything else further that you talked about, or have another topic?
Sorry about that. Yeah, I might look more about the connected apps, but then I might also look kind of about the backup and restore. It's just links in the trail mix.
Okay. Okay. So I wanted to do a little bit on some of the options for multi-org, just sort of high level, like the Salesforce to Salesforce, and then I think it's Lightning Connect, and just look at a couple of different options and how that might work. Maybe I'll do that. Okay, great. So we'll meet at the same time next week, and we will cover, sounds like we're We covered JSON basics, security part 2, connected apps and backup restore, and multi-org, integrating different orgs together. So, all right, so I will put the recordings up and start the new slide, and we'll see everybody again next week. And thanks for those of you that joined to listen in.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great to meet you guys here. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.